Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics to help bridge the gap that exists between what we know and what we do in early childhood education. We're starting conversations with academics, authors, decision makers, educators, and parents so that together we can improve the quality of early childhood education, while at the same time protecting and respecting the childhood experience. Have you been asked how your preschool classroom aligns with the science of reading? Or maybe you've seen videos of 2-year-olds reading fluently and the sales page headlines that say simply applying the science can give all toddlers the advantage they deserve. Well, in this episode, we're adding on to the basic background and history of the science of reading covered in the previous episode and digging deeper into what all this science means for the preschool classroom. Before we begin, a quick reminder that the Why We Play letters will help you jumpstart important conversations in your learning community about the importance and power of play in your early childhood setting, including how it supports reading development in our youngest learners. People don't value what they don't understand. If you want to help parents and colleagues understand the value of play, the Why We Play letters were created just for you. Learn more and grab a free sample letter at notjustcute.com/whyweplay. I'm excited to continue this deep dive on literacy. You know I love to cite my sources, so be sure to find this episode's show notes, which will once again be full of links and tidbits related to this episode. You'll find those at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 57. And again, if I reference something you don't see there, email me at amanda@notjustcute.com and I'll get it updated. If you're jumping in with this episode, first of all, welcome. Second of all, know that this is part 2 of a series. In the previous episode, I did a deep dive on some of the history of reading instruction in America and how we arrived at the term the science of reading. For the long version with all the details, go to episode 56. But the short version goes something like this. In the year 2000, the National Reading Panel released a report based on a strictly scientific methodology analyzing what factors help build strong readers. They emphasized 5 key components: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Those findings have become the backbone of what is now referred to as the science of reading. They're sometimes called the Big Five or the 5 pillars of reading. The impact of that report over the next 2 decades was varied. Some educators applied it in various ways. Others were completely oblivious to it. Fast forward to 2018, and education journalist Emily Hanford, as well as other notable authors and academics, began writing about the realization that most literacy programs in the United States were neglecting these scientific findings. Most notably, the explicit teaching of phonemic awareness and phonics, and that many children were struggling to read because of it. When we wrapped up the last episode, we were discussing the limitations of the National Reading Panel's findings, not as a criticism, but as a means to better understand the report's context and how to best apply the findings. One limitation of particular note to the early childhood crowd is that this research was based on grades K through 12. So, if I'm asked to apply the science of reading to a preschool classroom, what does that even mean? Can I just plop those same findings into a room designed for smaller humans? Well, if you remember, the National Reading Panel was pretty strict about their scientific rigor, so they noticed this limitation themselves. Almost as soon as the report was released, the National Early Literacy Panel was organized to fill the gap. One thing I notice here is the difference in names. The National Reading Panel versus the National Early Literacy Panel. When I teach workshops about literacy in early childhood, I make this distinction myself. I can't speak for the panel's motivation, but particularly in the early years, I find it's more helpful to talk about literacy rather than reading. Often, the term reading seems to frame the topic as a performance task. It's black or white. Children can read or they can't. Discussing reading seems to imply that our goal is to get these young children to jump right into reading the words on the page as quickly as possible. But literacy, in reality and in the framing of the conversation, is a whole collection of skills that help a child to learn, grow, and develop in an incremental and integrated way in order to become fully competent and independent as readers, writers, and communicators. So this early literacy panel was chaired by Timothy Shanahan, who I mentioned before was also on the National Reading Panel. The process and the methods were similar to those used by the National Reading Panel years earlier. There was a high bar for certainty, and it was focused on very specific questions. The panel wanted to know what the science said about precursors to literacy achievement. So the question was never, how do we get our preschoolers and toddlers to be fluent readers as soon as possible, but how do we support that foundation for real learning and growth? This is the appropriate developmental perspective. Reading is not developmental in the sense that it will just happen naturally, like learning to speak. We discussed that misconception in the previous episode. But reading is a developmental process in that it is incremental. We don't start laying bricks on the top row first. We don't start with flashcards and decodable books. We build each row one at a time to support growth. Reading doesn't start with fluent conventional reading. It's not a switch that we turn on. It's more like a dial that is gradually turned up. If you picture a progression along a line, at one end we start with foundational literacy. This is often where our infants and toddlers are. Starting here, every relationship and connected language experience builds that foundation for sounds and words and meaning. Then we have emergent literacy. This is where many of our preschoolers are. It's where certain skills begin to emerge and connect. I'll talk about these emergent skills in a moment. Then typically in kindergarten to first grades, we have early literacy, followed by transitional literacy, often around second grade, and fluent literacy, hopefully by third grade. And then we continue to build upon that proficiency throughout our lives. That process is a much different proposition than, are the children reading or not reading? Do we teach babies to read? Check yes or no. We are incrementally building real, well-rounded literacy for years. Let's focus on that emergent literacy phase where most of our preschoolers are. This phase rests on the foundational literacy experiences of our infants and toddlers. Every conversation, every story, every song, these language experiences are building that foundation in those early years. I often ask teachers in my workshops, when is it that we start to teach reading? And if they don't know at the beginning, they know by the end that we start to, quote unquote, teach reading as soon as a child can hear our voice. We start to build a foundation. And then from there, we start to build the emergent phase. So what does the science say we should be teaching during this emergent phase of preschool? Most likely, if I look for a book or a resource with that science of reading stamp on it, I will find the same elements from the National Reading Panel applied to preschoolers. But again, remember, that study was for K through 12. The Birth to 5 focused National Early Literacy Panel made similar findings in their report in 2008, but they were not exactly the same. Much of its emphasis was on alphabet knowledge, knowing the form of the letters and their sounds, phonological awareness, hearing and playing with the sounds and parts within words, early writing, concepts of print, and oral language. You probably noticed some similar components to the Big Five of the earlier report, but with some really important distinctions that we'll talk about in a moment. And then what about the 20 or so years since those key reports were published? Well, in 2021, the Institute of Educational Sciences published a report called Effectiveness of Early Literacy Instruction, Summary of 20 Years of Research. It was intended to fill that exact gap from the National Early Literacy Panel to 2021. If we want science-based literacy, we need the current science. This report, which of course will be linked in the show notes, evaluated published peer-reviewed research as well as other available research sources from about 2000 to 2020. I don't know if I would be so bold as to call it the quote-unquote science of reading for preschool. That title comes with a lot of baggage and I don't think I could carry it. But if I was asked about applying the current body of science and research on literacy to preschool, I would definitely bring up this report. This review outlined 5 key domains for building literacy and language. These may start sounding familiar. Oral language, phonological awareness, print knowledge, which here included concepts of print as well as names and sounds for letters of the alphabet, decoding, and early writing. Now, as I said earlier, if I had someone telling me that I absolutely had to show that I had a preschool curriculum that fit the big 5 elements of the science of reading, I could make these same elements fit under those headings to get the job done. But if someone wanted to have an actual conversation about what science says about early literacy, or if I'm making decisions about the practices and the tools that I'm bringing into my classroom, I'm going to look more carefully at the science specific to my little ones. So I'm going to go with this report. I'm going to talk about how the elements from this report are a little different from the 5 science of reading components that are more generally written into resources and requirements today. But first, I want to pivot a little for some context. Before we talk about what each skill looks like, we need to frame that in the context of how those skills are taught. We need to find the yes and. I am completely in favor of having discussions about what the science says about best practice for building early literacy. Yes. And we also have to remember that literacy is not the totality of early education. It's certainly an important part, but it isn't the only part. When looking at studies on the long-term impacts of preschool and kindergarten, some of the most consistent data comes from the outcomes tied to social skill development and soft skills. I'm not saying that the early academic skills don't matter, but if we're pushing those at the expense of social skills or critical thinking or creativity, we're missing the big picture and we're not serving children well. So let's keep that perspective. Another yes and, as we talk about the science of reading, let's also couch that in the context of the science of learning. Every nerd has academic crushes, and one of mine is Dr. 𝐞𝐞. She's a professor of psychology at Temple University and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and she's awesome. She's written and worked on and said so many things that have really inspired and influenced me. I have a lot of respect for her and her work. In 2015, she participated with several other academics to combine research in psychology, education, neuroscience, machine learning, linguistics, and more to create a consensus on optimal learning environments. They called it the science of learning. She and her colleagues asserted, based on the research, that children learn best when learning is active, engaging, meaningful, social, iterative, and joyful. 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞 often points out that these elements are also inherent in play. Playful learning is the term she and her partners use to describe the practice where adults prepare, support, and scaffold playful environments and interactions to support real learning in young children. And they assert that that's where the best learning happens. So that means that as I look at how I support the elements of literacy development, I must also look at how to make those experiences active, engaging, meaningful, social, iterative, which, by the way, means it can be done over and over and changed as we construct our understanding. It's the tinkering process. And perhaps most important on this list, joyful. I was listening to 𝐞𝐞𝐞 speak online recently, and she shared the example of playful learning as it relates to literacy targets. She described an activity intended to build vocabulary. In one group, the teacher read a story and then used flashcards to review the target vocabulary words. In another group, the teacher read the story and then supported the children in a guided play scenario where the children led the play and the teacher provided scaffolding through invitations and interactions to reinforce those same concepts. Guess which group had better mastery of the target vocabulary words? The guided play group. Play works, even for targeted skills like those needed to build literacy. This aligns with what NACCE says about academic learning in the early years on their position statement about developmentally appropriate practice. And if you're not familiar with NACCE, that's the National Association for the Education of Young Children. They said this: all subject matter can be taught in ways that are meaningful and engaging for children. The notion that young children are not ready for academic subject matter is a misunderstanding of developmentally appropriate practice. That's the end of the quote. So it's how we teach that makes all the difference. As we go back to that summary report by the Institute of Education Sciences, or IES, in 2021, and we think about what those elements might look like, keep in mind that the science of reading needs to fit within the science of learning. It also needs to fit with where your children are. Meet them where they are and build up. Don't jump in where you think they should be. The best teaching is more responsive than it is prescriptive. So, with all the necessary context, the table is now set. Let's go over these elements outlined by the IES, the Institute of Education Sciences, back in 2021. Like I said before, if I was pressed to make my preschool practice fit the framework of the Big Five from the Science of Reading framework, I'm sure that I could do it. These categories are all definitely related. But if we want to be true to the actual science and not just the buzzwords, and if we want to do the best work we can for our children, these differences and these details really do matter. So we start off the list with oral language. Oral language factors into the Science of Reading's Big Five, but it doesn't get its own shout out. I could put it under vocabulary if I had to, but it is so much more. It's words, but it's also structure and concepts and usage. In the preschool years, oral language is key. There's loads of data that shows us that conversational turns have a huge impact on this early developmental period. I'll link to a podcast that I did with Dr. Rachel Romeo talking about her research and how rich conversation literally changes brains. Preschool should be a place full of interaction and conversations. These conversations build both receptive and expressive oral language skills. That means young children should learn and gain experience both with being good listeners and with being the speaker. They should be read to often and invited into conversations about what's being read. They should have opportunities to share ideas, ask questions, think out loud, and discover new words and ideas together. These experiences are building oral language and also building critical thinkers. Another one of the key ways children work on their oral language skills is through play. A preschool classroom should have a happy buzz of busy, playful children engaging in conversation. A silent classroom is a terrible place to build oral language skills. Next on the list, we have phonological awareness. This is slightly different from phonemic awareness, which was on the original studies list. If you think of phonological awareness as an overarching category of skills, phonemic awareness is a specific subset underneath it. So for the older children in the K-12 report, the focus is on the smallest increment, the phonemes. But when we're thinking about younger children, we have to realize that there's more to that foundation that still needs to be built. Phonological awareness includes those other sound-based skills. Can children hear the different words in a sentence? Even toddlers may play games where they step or hop or clap once per word to show this awareness of words as separate units of speech, just in the sound. The next level from there would have children separating words into syllables or combining syllables into words. Phonological skills also include rhyming words and isolating or matching beginning sounds and ending sounds. There are many different levels where a word can be divided and put back together, ultimately coming to each individual phoneme, the smallest increment of sound in our language. That's the phonemic awareness part of phonological awareness. I'll link an article that actually comes from Victoria State Government in Australia. It has one of my favorite graphics for illustrating how all of these skills fit together, and I think it would be a great place to brush up on some of these terms if that's something you're wanting to learn more about. We know that phonological skills may be built through games, songs, nursery rhymes, movement activities, and stories. We are building an awareness of the sounds within words. Third on the list is print knowledge. This includes concepts of print such as just simply the realization that print carries meaning, as well as how to hold a book and turn the pages. When children ask you to read a book, or even if they pretend to read to themselves, that demonstrates an understanding of certain concepts of print. Print knowledge also includes an understanding that print follows from left to right and top to bottom on a page, even before a child is actually reading those words. Within print knowledge, the report includes alphabetic knowledge, recognizing letters and the sounds associated with them. I usually treat this as a separate category from concepts of print, but you can also see how they're interrelated. This is actually the beginning of phonics. How are we helping children in a playful way to become familiar with letters and their sounds? There are many, many ways to explore letters in the sensory bin, at the art table, with Play-Doh, at the puzzle table, in our book area, with music, movement, and at dramatic play. We can incorporate letters and conversations about them in very natural, engaging ways. We can also incorporate very short, engaging mini lessons. When I was teaching preschoolers, I used something called the Amazing Action Alphabet. It gave us the opportunity to focus on a specific letter for a very short mini lesson with a story using the name, shape, and sound of that featured letter, and giving the children an action to do when they made that letter's sound. It took only a few minutes, and it was a playful way to practice that anchor knowledge to connect to other meaningful experiences with letters throughout the room. There are many simple ways to incorporate intentional, systematic practice in very brief, meaningful ways that are appropriate to your particular group of children. Decoding is next on the list, but please remember that this skill is built upon the others before it. Decoding is often what we call sounding out a word. We're taking a set of letters, recognizing them and their sounds, stretching out all those individual sounds, those phonemes, and we're putting them back together to form a word. You can see how many of these skills we just talked about are required in order to do this. So this is a skill that we can work on later in preschool and into kindergarten, but it certainly isn't the first skill we start with. Decoding rests upon oral language, phonemic awareness, concepts of print, and alphabetic knowledge. We're not sitting down on day one to decode with toddlers. But as your individual children become ready, once they've built this strong foundation, then they may be ready to start decoding. We often think of this in teacher-led activities, where 2 letter cards are presented, perhaps an A and a T. Their sounds are made, ah, t. And then the sounds are blended together, ah, t, at, at. That's one type of decoding practice. When I had preschoolers who were ready for this skill, I did do something like this, but with a construction scene where we would literally build words together by pulling letters up with a big crane, which of course was really just a picture on a poster board with a string that could pull up the letter cards. We do whatever it takes to make things active, engaging, meaningful, social, iterative, and joyful, right? It was a fun way to play with building words. But these teacher-guided activities aren't the only place where decoding practice happens. It can also happen with fun games and songs. It happens when children begin to decode the books and the print that you have in the room. And as children begin to write independently, even with inventive spelling. As they think of the words that they want to write at the writing table or in the dramatic play area or in their journals, they are stretching out sounds and writing the corresponding letters as they know them. It's essentially the encoding side of decoding, and it works those same skills. That's part of why early writing, the final individual element on this list, is such a powerhouse. Early writing brings in multiple concepts we've already talked about, and it can be used in many different ways. Maybe you're having children dictate stories to you. You write their stories down and read them back as you point to each word. That's not only an early writing experience, but it's reinforcing concepts of print, the realization that their spoken words are now written down, that those written words are then decoded and spoken out loud again, that each word is made up of letters, and that those letters make up those spoken sounds, and that all of that comes from a story that they created with their creativity and their use of oral language. That's a powerful activity. As children begin to do this early writing themselves, it not only rests on and reinforces this foundation of language concepts, but it also depends on a wide array of fine motor experiences. As I've said before, by the time a child holds that pencil in their hands, those hands should also have had lots of opportunities to dig, pull, climb, press, twist, and pinch in a wide range of environments and with a variety of materials. In a million little ways and in a million little muscle fibers, play is building writers. For each of these early literacy areas, it's imperative that we meet children where they are. We support them and focus on helping them get what they need, not in doing what we want to see. This isn't a performance, and we're not looking for parlor tricks. And on that note, can we do a quick rundown of reading parlor tricks and myths that I've been seeing on the internet lately? With the added emphasis on the science of reading, sometimes people play a little fast and loose with what they call science. So let's straighten things out by going to the science. Okay, here we go. This will kind of be rapid fire, but there will be links in the show notes if you want to take a deeper dive into each one. First off, your baby can read. This is the only program I'm going to call out by name, and that's only because it's actually already a matter of public record that this program is bogus. It was fined millions of dollars by the FTC in 2014 for making unfounded claims about babies and toddlers learning to read from this company's flashcards and videos. In spite of all the late-night infomercials showing toddlers reading, a study comparing infants and toddlers who had randomly been assigned to either use or not use the program, researchers found that the two groups were only significantly different on one measure. That measure was their parents' beliefs. The parents of the children using the program believed that they were actually reading. Every other measure of real literacy skills was indistinguishable between the groups. Real reading is not a parlor trick. It's years of carefully laid layers of rich experiences and honed skills. And while some 2-year-olds can actually read, it is a rare exception, not a norm for us to strive toward. I bring this up because while I thought that the study, the ruling, and the fine closed that proverbial book on getting babies and toddlers to skip right into reading, I still find marketing targeting this age group. Their methods may be soundly rooted in the science of reading, but as I've pointed out in this series, that science was not derived from studying toddlers. It's not meant to be applied to them either. Start with strong oral language skills. Build the foundation and work toward emergent literacy in the preschool years. Next up, in this same category of sooner is better, therefore buy my product today, I've come across sales copy that states that children who are better readers earlier perform better years later. This idea of earlier readers is then applied to toddlers and 3-year-olds. Ditch the well-rounded literacy foundations and just get those kiddos reading already. Well, the study they're referencing is likely the one that you're going to find in your show notes under early reading acquisition. And it looked at first graders' reading abilities, not 3-year-olds. Some are making similar claims that early reading or early literacy has certain benefits, implying that you need their program to teach your toddlers to read in order to get these early reader benefits. Often, the research they're citing is actually reinforcing broad literacy development. Yes, supporting developmentally appropriate literacy experiences will benefit even the youngest learners, and there are a million ways that you can show that with research. But that research isn't saying the children have been taught to read, as some of these sites will imply. For example, I came across a site recently that said you should buy their program because research had shown that early reading can boost IQs by 6 points. When I tracked down the study, I found that the early reading that it actually referenced wasn't toddlers blowing through flashcards. It was examining the impact of dialogic or interactive reading. So yes, reading to young children and interacting with them, having rich discussions around those stories as you go, that does have a positive impact on IQ. This kind of early reading or early literacy really does matter. But you don't need to buy a program to get it, and you don't need to teach toddlers to read. Often these misleading claims are used to sell something. They press on fears and anxieties to make the sale. But one last myth that I want to address also has the potential to impact policy and school decisions, and it is this: kids who need to catch up don't have time for play. There are too many children who could suffer under this myth. The idea that young children who are at risk need more drilling and less play misses the research. In the early years, if a child is considered behind, it's very likely that they are behind in oral language, interactions, and experiences as well. Supported play is one of the best ways to help them catch up, particularly in language skills. An article from the International Literacy Association challenges us to expand the science of reading to recognize the contributions of play experiences in early literacy. It speaks to many of the ways play supports the same elements of early literacy that we've been discussing. It also points out that by one measure, 33% of teachers serving low-income families said they did not have time for play in their classroom, while only 3% of programs serving upper-income families said the same. Too many children are arriving at school with a play deficit, only to have that challenge compounded. Integrating literacy and play will not only support better overall development, but it will also support more effective literacy learning. As just one of many examples shared in the article, in a study focusing on at-risk preschool children, researchers placed those children into two groups, one for explicit literacy instruction and one for a shortened session of explicit instruction, a mini lesson, and then 10 minutes of supported imaginative play. Both conditions used the same amount of time overall. They just differed in how the material was delivered. The children in the group with the play component showed more growth in language development than those in the explicit instruction only group, and they moved from scoring below expectations to on age level after only 4 months. While the renewed emphasis on research and science in early literacy is important, any assumption that this new emphasis on more intentional teaching of specific skills means that preschoolers and kindergartners no longer need play simply ignores the research. These goals are not mutually exclusive. Play is the method, and learning is the outcome. We've covered a ton of ground in these 2 episodes. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope that it's helped you to understand a little more about what people are talking about when they reference the science of reading. And even more so, I hope it's helped you to know what that really means for your classroom. I also hope that you've recognized things that you're already doing to build literacy, and that you can now do those things with greater intention. And ultimately, I hope I've sparked some new ideas for you to explore and expand on to better serve the children you love and teach, because they're the reason we do this. Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 57. There you'll find tons of links to resources and fascinating tidbits on this topic that I know that you'll love. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com. You can also stay tuned for social media updates on Instagram by following me at Amanda_NotJustCute. If you have big ahas or new questions, send those to Amanda at notjustcute.com. Thanks for listening today, and as always, thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.